Hey everyone, welcome to the Week 14 edition, the Part 2 by Mageddon edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm Joe Bartel. Alongside me every week is Jake Letarski. We're going to get into the players that I think there's some consequential pickups, of course, as a Guerendo and the strategy for him. Spoiler, just go get him if you can. Whoever has fab, that's what you're shooting for. But we'll go for all the necessary players and the strategy, not for this week, but also the fantasy playoffs too, and some streaming options that are out there. So let's hit the music. Again, welcome over to the Tuesday, December 3rd edition of the RotoWire NFL Podcast. I'm Joe Bartel. You can follow me at JB Fantasy Sports on Twitter. You can follow Jake Letarski at RotoJake. We're diving into the Week 14 Waiver Wire pickups this week. 6 teams on bye. Second time here that we've had 6 teams on bye. Broncos, Colts, Patriots, Commanders, Ravens, and Texans. I thought there would be more relevant fantasy decisions like the Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin's and Jonathan Taylors and Lamar Jacksons of the world. Turns out, Jake, it's just basically me that's been rostering all of them. So my bye week 14 situation is bleak, but we're going to be trying to get through and solve that for everyone.
In addition to that, we have injuries at a whole lot of positions this week too. So, for some people, it'll be like 10 teams are on bye. We'll just have to take a look and give you some options.
Yep, and let's start it off right away with your top 5 list, and this will be the number 1 player for me as well too. But Isaac Guerendo, who is now primed. I mean, is he going to – let's talk about that. Let's layer this as to how impactful of a fantasy pickup he is going to be. We are in Week 14. Arguably, this is where you're spending all your fab anyway if you're trying to make it into the playoffs, whatever else. So the idea or strategy behind dump everything into Guerendo isn't revolutionary. But is he going to be a difference maker to the extent that you're playing him immediately as a running back too, even next week when there are 0 teams on bye?
Well, I think you need to get him no matter what. If you have fringe running backs that you've been starting, or especially this week, you need to go get him. If you don't and you're setting your running backs, you still need to go get him. Use that top priority. I had a question today. Someone texted me, I have $71 in budget. How much do I spend? And I said either look for who has the second most money and do $1 more than them, or spend it all if somebody else has more money than you, and hopefully you come up with Guerendo. He's only 8% rostered in Yahoo leagues. He's the pickup here. We have Christian McCaffrey on IR with, I believe it's a PCL. And then Jordan Mason. I was all excited to have picked up Jordan Mason as part of the Handcraft group last week, but he's on IR with a high ankle sprain now. So we have Guerendo. Patrick Taylor will probably get activated off the practice squad and used a little bit here, but there is very rarely, if ever, a fantasy pickup the caliber of Guerendo in Week 14. And I believe he is talented enough to get the job done, at least plus on the talent side. And most importantly, it is opportunity here. Even though the 49ers at 5-7 will be fighting for their playoff lives here, Shanahan and company always know how to draw up a run play, a run game. It can be anyone in that backfield, really, that is a fantasy productive player here. And I think Guerendo has a chance to be the top 20 back, week in and week out moving forward here. I mean, a lot of the measurables work out nicely. They have the Bears this week, who are 24 against backs in half PPR, followed by the Rams, who are 23, and the Dolphins, who are 22. So it gets a little harder against Detroit in the fantasy championship game, but you have a man with a very favorable schedule and all the opportunity in the world on a solid offense. Purdy's finally healthy. There are so many passing game threats that you can't really load up the box against the 49ers. So Guerendo, far and away the top pick. Use your top waiver wire claim. Do whatever you can to go ahead and get him on your team this week. Even if you have, I don't know, I have a league that I've got Breece Hall, Jahmyr Gibbs, Tyrone Tracy, and Bucky Irving. I'm still using my top claim on Guerendo because I don't want anyone else to overtake me in points this week. I want to make sure my playoff seeding is as good as it can be, and get ready to go. And most of all, I don't want to face Guerendo in the playoffs if I have the opportunity to get him.
That's the big one to me. You're blocking somebody else from getting Guerendo, even if in this case he'd be the 5th running back on your team. It means that somebody else might not be able to stumble to running back too. And I think back to a couple of years ago, it was still when Austin Eckler was in the Chargers. He got concussed, and there was one week where Justin Jackson was your starting running back for the Chargers, and he literally won people leagues because he got 28 points or whatever it was that week. Where I don't want to go into hyperbole per se, but I think that's the level of ideal situation for Guerendo rest of season here with Jordan Mason and Christian McCaffrey on bye. You mentioned Patrick Taylor. Taylor's a good pass catching running back. The Niners don't always use them that way, and I think Guerendo's going to be out there for last snaps and have advantages that the Kyle Shanahan offense provides you from a rushing perspective. So I think Guerendo is one of those obvious waiver wire pickups that we've not had all season long. Somebody in the chat asked Guerendo or Pacheco. You're still playing Pacheco. Like, I think it's the Chiefs' offense is way better, right?
Yeah, I don't know about that because Guerendo should command a much higher snap share and percentage of the touches. Kareem Hunt is still involved to some degree with Pacheco, and it's not like Pacheco has light the world up since he came back here. So if you're guessing who to start this week, I'd probably go Guerendo.
I think I'm still playing Pacheco, but that's the kind of relevant conversation that we need to have with Guerendo being the obvious way where
if we're split on this, he's high enough up on those rankings, and that should give you a picture of the importance of adding him.
Yeah. All right. Let's go to number 2 on your top 5 waiver wire pickup list for this week.
I went with Adam Thielen at 32% here. Clearly, he is the guy. He finds ways to get open here. And yes, you can make an argument that they want to develop guys like Xavier Legette, but most importantly, they want to develop Bryce Young, who is starting to seemingly turn a corner and might even be in streaming play. Although it's a tough matchup against the Eagles this week, Adam Thielen is the receiver that you want to get. Technically, he is behind Xavier Legette and David Moore in snap share and routes, but he also but that's meaningless when he has a team-high 10 targets, finishes with 8 for 99 and a touchdown, still had over 100 air yards, only slightly behind in the top 2. And like I said, tough matchup at Philly this week, but you could see starting him given the bye week situation. And then he's got Dallas, who's 19, Arizona, who's 14, and Tampa Bay at 23. He's absolutely in the conversation, and the ownership's a little bit higher up there, but I think you need to go get him too if you can.
Yeah, Thielen was number 2 on my list. I think the 1-2 are pretty obvious in Guerendo and Thielen, and you could find other receivers. There's a lot of droppable candidates or guys that were dropped over the past week or week 2 that are on there, but I think Thielen makes a lot of sense. You mentioned Xavier Legette. I had talked with Jeff Erickson and Nick Whalen a couple weeks ago that the Panthers, it would make sense to develop the undrafted free agent Jalen Coker, who's been injured during this process. Once Coker comes back, I still think Thielen is going to be more involved because you were right and Jeff were right that the most important thing is making Bryce Young look legitimate, and he has. And it's been very successful. So I think in that regard, even if Panthers aren't winning, it's the correct call. And Thielen is absolutely, I think, not even just a pickup, but probably a play this week in a lot of situations too.
Yeah, absolutely. So then number 3, I go to another receiver. We've mentioned him over and over again here, but the regression still hasn't happened. I'm talking about Nick Westbrook-Ikhine from the Tennessee Titans. Only 18% rostered, now has 8 touchdowns in his last 8 games. I threw him on here because you just can't deny it anymore, and I'm gonna have to make decisions of do I start him or do I start guys like Devontae Adams, because that's what we're looking at, him or JSN. I mean, like it's getting really tough in this situation here, and he has got the best rest of season schedule you can really hope and dream for. He's got Jacksonville this week, who's number 30 against receivers. Then he's got Cincinnati. Both of those games are home games, and we know what the Bengals defense can give up here. At Indy, who's 15, and then at Jacksonville again, that's 30. So I mean, the regression hasn't happened yet. He got 2 touchdowns on just 3 catches this week. But man, Will Levis is maybe looking slightly better. Maybe some of it's garbage time. But Westbrook-Ikhine is a very startable wide receiver, and everyone has the same hesitations that we do about can this continue here, and that's why he's only 18% rostered. But at this point, you need to go ahead and fix that if he's out there in your league.
Yeah, Marquez Valdes-Scantling probably applies to that same sort of conversation too, given his touchdown streak now at this point, not to the extent of Westbrook-Ikhine, but right up there as well.
And the fact that Taysom Hill is out, so there are going to be a lot more touches. I think the offense is going to be significantly worse because they're out of bodies, but there are more touches available to the wide receivers there.
Yeah, I'll throw in my number 3 just because we're going back and forth. It feels like this show. And I mentioned Parker Washington of Jacksonville. He had 12 targets last week. Now Lawrence likely out this week, and I would assume next week too, given the severity and the eyes related to that concussion and nasty hit by the Texans player. I think Parker Washington is an interesting candidate. He was somebody that we mentioned last year as well too, around the same time. Back when Christian Kirk got injured, Evan Ingram ended up stepping up. But Washington is going to be involved. I think some of the passing game just seems to be the only way they're operating the offense. Both Etienne and Bigsby haven't been all that effective over recent weeks. And I think Parker Washington in deeper formats is one of those that if you really need to stream a receiver this week, it's in that Devon Vele conversation with the Broncos on bye. Like that's that's the level in which you're looking at for a receiver. And I think Parker Washington is one of those top options.
Yeah, I mean it's tough for me to really get the reason he didn't make my list. I'll say is we're gonna have Mac Jones as his quarterback, and then he's got the Titans and the Jets coming up, which aren't good matchups. But in his favor, he did play 59 of 70 snaps, and I mean he's just the number 2 wide receiver to Brian Thomas in reality. You can't ignore the 12 targets. I mean, honestly, that's massive, 22.3 PPR points this week. But the matchups and the Mac Jones factor is what put him outside my top 5, though. He definitely is in consideration.
All right, let's go to the number 4 guy. And you picked one specific quarterback. I kind of just gestured vaguely at the streaming quarterback position. So who's your number 4 option?
Yeah, obviously we're going to have to stream some quarterbacks this week here. Bo Nix, a guy who's actually been starting. Anthony Richardson, some people have had to start. Jaden Daniels, you're definitely starting. Lamar Jackson, CJ Stroud. Obviously Trevor Lawrence is out of the mix now. Drake May is on a bye this week. Streaming quarterback is big. Even if you don't need to stream a quarterback, if your opponent does, this is another block your opponent situation here because it's win at all costs for a lot of people to find their way into the playoffs this week. So for my pick, I picked Russell Wilson. He's 36% rostered, a little bit less of availability. I believe he has Cleveland this week. Now, granted, he's not going to ball out like he does against the Bengals because everybody balls out against the Bengals here. But Russell Wilson, out of all the guys that are playing this week and are less than 50% rostered, I ranked him at the top of the list. Now, there are a lot of guys in the 2 to 5% rostered that we're going to talk about in a bit. Some have very, very good matchups. So there'll be more quarterbacks here. And I understand your generic, just your streaming quarterback option here. But I think Russell Wilson is one that you probably want to block your opponent on if you can, or go ahead and grab him if you've been, if you had Lamar Jackson, you didn't need to roster another quarterback on your team the entirety of this year. And Jaden Daniels was getting into that territory as well. So go grab Russell Wilson or whatever quarterback you need. That's number 4 on my list.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I have one league where I'm starting Sam Darnold. Another league that I'm going between Geno Smith and Brock Purdy. I've benched Brock Purdy the past 2 weeks. In those events, I was looking at waiver wire guys. Caleb Williams is somehow available. He's just over our threshold of 50% at 55 on Yahoo. Caleb Williams is scheduled rest of the season. Vikings, Lions, Seahawks, especially with the injuries to the Lions over the past 2 or 3 weeks. That's not that bad end of season schedule. I think Caleb Williams has seemingly turned the corner now. We'll have to see with Eberflus gone. Now Thomas Brown, offensive coordinator, turned head coach. Does that affect the development of Caleb Williams? I would assume no, but that's one of those interesting options. Outside of that, you're right. I mean, I don't really want to start Russell Wilson against the Browns if I can help it. I think that's going to be a Najee Harris game, and let's ball control and let the defense win it. And then the following week against the Eagles too, whoever picks up Russell Wilson in the first week of the fantasy playoffs isn't really going to be playing against the Eagles. So I think you're more like trying to block the semifinals or possibly finals matchup against the Ravens in week 16. I would actually go a different direction, whether that be possibly Jameis Winston, given the volume. I understand going to the Steelers this week, but he's producing a ton of fantasy points. Broncos is supposed to be a tough matchup too. He throws for almost 500 yards. Or if you're trying to block somebody, Bryce Young as well too. You look at the Eagles is a tough matchup this week, but Cowboys, Cardinals, Buccaneers, Bryce Young would actually be a fringe top 15 starter in the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, and going to our questions here, I still play Patrick Mahomes over Russell Wilson. I think, even if he's not been the greatest fantasy quarterback this year, I think that's a much safer play. And, and then somebody else asked about tight ends, which I think we're going to get to right now because we both have number 5 on our list is Juwan Johnson of the New Orleans Saints. He's pretty much universally available here. I was so happy to get Taysom Hill and start him in a league when someone dropped him during his bye. Now, obviously, I got to go back to the drawing board, and I'm going to be looking hard for Juwan Johnson. And I might use my waiver wire claim on that, after Guerendo, see how that works. He had a 71% snap share in week 13. Also, team high 32 routes ran. That's higher than any of the wide receivers on the list. He finished with 5 for 7 and 35 yards, which isn't eye-popping, but it is a season high in targets for him. Most importantly, I know Taysom Hill plays all over the place, but technically he is a tight end. I think Juwan Johnson could finish as the top receiver for the Saints a few more times this year, and he also is used all the time in the red zone. Before this week, Juwan Johnson is kind of a touchdown dependent option. Pick him up if you're desperate. He cycled through guys like Otten and Henry and Jonnu Smith and even Mike Gesicki, but he was kind of at the bottom of that. He gets elevated significantly. He's the top among tight ends, and he makes my top 5 pickup. That's also a possible block candidate, depending on there are a lot of tight ends on bye this week that are significant. And Juwan Johnson's number 5 for me. I wanted to work Brandon Cooks on here. I'll throw him in here as an honorable mention.
Sure.
10%. He's got a lot going for him in Dallas, minus the Cooper Rush factor. But it's a great matchup against the Bengals. CeeDee Lamb's banged up. I don't imagine he sits, but Brandon Cooks had significant usage in his return from IR. We kind of almost forgot about that. Maybe we just had a bullet point on him last week. Only a 40% snap share last week, but a 56% route share, team high 7 targets. He didn't necessarily benefit from CeeDee Lamb leaving. They kind of cycled in Jonathan Mingo and Jalen Brooks instead. But, and again, I picked that up from Jerry's phenomenal box score breakdown article. But Brandon Cooks is also a possibly startable receiver, just given the matchup this week against the Bengals. The Bengals defense cannot stop anybody, and I wanted to throw him in the mix here right off at the top of the show.
Yeah, Juwan Jennings and Juwan Johnson are going to be the 2 Juwans that might make a fantasy difference from a waiver wire perspective. Juwan Jennings earlier this season, now Juwan Johnson for the Saints here to end it. I like the Brandon Cooks call. I'm having a debate in a few places dropping Jake Ferguson. I think he ends up playing. The only issue is it's a Monday night game. And in our situation, for example, for the NFFC auction draft, our lone remaining healthy receiver that matters is CeeDee Lamb. If CeeDee Lamb were to not play, we kind of need Brandon Cooks to go out there instead. So if you have Lamb, don't really have any other roster ways to protect yourself in the event that somebody can't play Monday, that's the scenario I do that. Or
absolutely, yeah.
You'd look like a Jake Ferguson or Luke Schoonmaker to be your flex for CD if CD gets ruled out. It sounds like he could play, but that's one of those things that we're doing this Tuesday that'll be of consequence Monday, a full 6 days later. Just something to keep an eye on right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, yeah, again, top 5 waiver wire list for us. Basically the same. First time in a while that we've had that. Isaac Guerendo, Adam Thielen, Juwan Johnson, 3 of the top 5 options, both for us. And then quarterback-wise, I had talked about Bryce Young as a streaming candidate rest of season. I don't really mind Jameis Winston rest of season 2, even if it is against the Steelers this week. That's a tough spot. You had talked about Russell Wilson, conversely, going against the Browns, although his week 15 and 16 stretch a little bit more difficult until he gets to the Ravens there. And then we had listed Parker Washington and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine as kind of fringy receiver options. In the case of Westbrook-Ikhine, certainly touchdown dependent, as is Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who's right up there too.
Exactly, and we'll have plenty more for you once we take a deeper dive by position.
All right, let's get a word from our sponsors, Blue Wire. And then one more word from our sponsors from Circa Sports. The end of the season is getting closer, and you can catch the big game poolside at Stadium Swim at Circa Resort and Casino in Las Vegas. 6 temperature-controlled pools, a massive 143-foot screen, and booming game sound. Plus, you can view the pyrotechnics and visual effects all throughout the game. Grab the best seat in the sun with day beds, poolside boxes, cabanas, and more. Stadium Swim's big game viewing party, February 9th at Circa Resort and Casino. Space is going fast. Reserve yours today at circalasvegas.com. Again, 6 teams on bye. From a quarterback perspective, maybe you're missing out on Anthony Richardson. You're certainly missing out on Lamar Jackson, maybe Stroud and Nix as well too. But Lawrence
Jaden Daniels,
yeah, Jaden Daniels as well. Thank you. Yeah, so a bunch of ones of consequence. The only issue is that maybe people aren't as dialed in because it's week 14. Most of the people might be out of it by that point. We'll have to see. So you had mentioned Russell Wilson as your top streaming candidate. My goodness. Who else is among that list?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Caleb Williams in the beginning. He's only 55% roster, which is why I left him off. But that is a plenty fine streaming candidate for this week here. And you noted his rest of season schedule: Vikings, Lions, Seahawks, after San Francisco this week. So there's a lot to like there. I actually think, despite, obviously we're in Packer country up here, but despite that, I think Caleb Williams looks good. Passes the eye test, can run the offense. That offense is kind of stagnated in the red zone a little bit, but he would be a fine option to go ahead here. Aaron Rodgers at 34%. I don't love that. They've even talked about benching him, so stay away from that a little bit. Jameis Winston, 16%. I really don't like him at Pittsburgh as much as you do, but you're right. He finds ways to dig himself out of holes and get into shootouts, so who knows? And maybe they get Cedric Tillman back this week, so that's interesting.
It was a bad matchup this week against the Broncos, and he throws for nearly 500 yards. If you're playing in leagues where interceptions don't really matter too, which is surprisingly a bunch of the ones that we play in, Jake. I just think
Yep.
there's such a volume part of this that he's going to give you 18 points, even if it looks bad, even if you're not happy about it. And there's upside scenarios. Like you think about the game 2 weeks ago in which they played the Steelers. That's as bad of conditions as he can get. And in standard scoring formats, he scored 18 points. It was in part because of that rushing touchdown. But I think Jameis Winston can produce plenty fine over these other options.
Sure. And then a guy I don't like so much, but I just threw on here for the heck of it. Derek Carr is only 15% rostered. He's at the Giants. The Giants get to the quarterback a lot, and I think the Saints are going to actually struggle to move the ball here because they don't have Taysom Hill to run these quarterback draws on 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3 that have been very successful, part of their offense there. So Carr's going to have to throw more.
Put Dexter Lawrence, their stud nose tackle, on injured reserve. That does, I think, negatively affect their defense pretty significantly. But you're right. Of these other guys, he's probably 4th on the list.
Yeah. Now, after this, what we have are bad 2-quarterback league limited options, but they all have really, really good matchups here. So I have to talk about Will Levis. We were talking about the Westbrook-Akine factor there. Will Levis is only 12% rostered. He's home against Jacksonville this week, and he gets the Bengals in Week 15. So Will Levis is actually a great 2-quarterback league option to look at here because he's kind of right around that fringe, maybe not rostered, especially if people are checked out. So he's one that could easily go as QB2 for the next couple of weeks, or in a pinch this week if you're in a deeper league where guys like Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston are already scooped up. Cooper Rush has to get mentioned because 5% rostered, home against Cincinnati. The Cowboys showed a little bit of life this week here. Obviously, it's tough given if CeeDee Lamb plays or not, if Jake Ferguson plays or not. You might be down some weapons here, but they've been able to. They're good. I mean, if anything, they'll probably be in a shootout with Cincinnati, and there's room. He'll throw 40 passes, so hopefully that turns into something. He's a very interesting streaming candidate. I like what I've seen from Bryce Young. You mentioned him as a possible streamer as well. I don't like him going on the road to Philly this week. That's not so hot. But you did note that he's got the Cowboys, Cardinals, and Buccaneers rest of season here. If you're wavering on quarterbacks or even stuck between him and Russell Wilson in some of Russ's tougher matchup weeks, then you have to take a look at Bryce Young. And one that I'm seeing come up a lot, came up in the chat already. I'm a little hesitant on this one compared to most, but Aiden O'Connell is 2% rostered. They're at Tampa Bay this week. Tampa Bay's defense has been pretty horrendous against the pass. And Aiden O'Connell actually had an okay game this week. The problem is I don't love a West Coast team traveling all the way across the country. Even if it is a good matchup against Tampa Bay, I'm probably looking to some of those aforementioned names over Aiden O'Connell if you get a chance, but he does make the conversation here.
I like Aiden O'Connell, I think, to be in the tier elevated above the Will Levises and Mac Joneses of the world. I'll play Aiden O'Connell over Bryce Young. I don't know about Cooper Rush. That one's a little bit tough. So that Bengals defense just looks absolutely beat down. But this is the one possibility for them to get right. The Cowboys are just way worse. Their offensive line's beat up as well, too. I would play Aiden O'Connell over Derek Carr, for example. But I think Jameis Winston, I'm still playing him over Aiden O'Connell. And that's kind of where it gets to be a little bit dicey in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And then after that, we have the 2 quarterback guys. I mean, Mac Jones replaced Trevor Lawrence. He could be the starter in Jacksonville for the rest of the season. Again, pretty tough. They got the Titans and the Jets. Then things get a little better with the Raiders and back to the Titans again in the fantasy championship. I wanted to make note that Matt Stafford has a minor ankle sprain, but apparently it shouldn't affect his status or preparation. But, you never know with these things on Tuesday, so keep an eye out there. And then I just wanted to be fun and controversial here. The Falcons are 6-6, which means they're very much in the playoff conversation in the NFC. There's going to be a team that's 500 or below that squeaks into the playoffs here. And I just speculate, do they consider moving from Cousins to Penix at some point here? Cousins looked atrocious. The Chargers, I think Herbert had less than 150 passing yards and still went on the road and beat Atlanta here. It was bad. It was real bad. So, if you're speculating, I wouldn't be opposed to cutting Cousins if you had to. And, maybe Penix is a stash if you can actually afford it in a 2-quarterback.
Do you care that this is a revenge game for Cousins against the Vikings?
Not particularly after how he looked last week.
I kind of feel like if there's one guy that knows what to do against the Brian Flores defense, it is Kirk Cousins.
Interesting.
And I would play Kirk Cousins over Jameis Winston or Bryce Young or Aiden O'Connell. That's kind of what I'm going to decide between. Mm-hmm. It's not great. Obviously, he has not looked very good over the past 3 weeks, despite decent enough matchups, maybe not the Chargers per se. But I think Kirk Cousins is going to do well against his former team. This is if there's one player that's going to perform out of spite, it's going to be Kirk Cousins against the Vikings.
Yeah, I just don't like doing it when every other factor is stacked against them, minus narrative, and narrative's the only reason here. But I don't know. We saw what Jerry Jeudy did to the Broncos last night, so who knows? And
that was supposed to be one of the spots where Patrick Surtain was going to race him. Well, the Broncos were dumb and didn't really put Surtain on him throughout most of that game. And then when he did race him. So we'll have to kind of see. Anything else quarterback-wise? Or are we good to move on?
Yep, we can move on.
All right. A new season of LIV Golf Fantasy is coming in 2025. New prizes, new ways to win, and more are coming in the new season. Get ready to play. You can sign up at fantasy.livegolf.com. It's fantasy.livegolf.com for the new 2025 LIV Golf season. I'm not much of a fantasy golf guy. I know a few of you might be out there from a DFS perspective too. So check that out. Again, fantasy.livegolf.com. All right, going to the running backs.
I love playing one-off fantasy golf. Just the 1 week thing. I know there's all sorts of season long that we got going on, but man, the one-off for the big tournaments, I can definitely get into.
RotoWire.com/try gets you 48-hour access to the site. Exactly. No credit card needed. You can look at all the golf stuff we're talking about, whether it be LIV or other different leagues, and the one-off competitions, the DFS pick'em stuff as well too. We got you all covered. RotoWire.com/try gets you access to that site for that LIV Golf. Kind of looking through. I owe you possibly a Culver's meal. I'm not sure where you lie on this one, Jake.
I believe it was a fantasy points bet, and I believe Gus Edwards.
I thought it was touches. And either way, you would have won. But did the listeners win? And shouldn't that matter at the end of the day, Jake?
That's a nice cop-out, Joe. I guess we can
deserve it. And if the listeners didn't win, then I'm not sure you won or I won, Jake, because both Gus Edwards and Kamani Vidal were relatively disappointing. It felt like the Chargers were very content letting the Falcons beat themselves. You mentioned the 4 interceptions for Kirk Cousins. One was a pick 6. The Falcons gladly obliged in that. If you want to know my thoughts, read any note written about Justin Herbert or Quentin Johnston or Ladd McConkey. I absolutely dunked on the Falcons, and I hope the editors did not remove how dumb the Atlanta team looked like. You can find it anywhere you read these notes. But we go now to Gus Edwards and Vidal. Vidal was involved. You talked about in the rundown here that Hassan Haskins gets 1 carry, fumbles it. That was predictable. You and I both mentioned that Hassan Haskins was going to be pushed out to the side. I thought Vidal was going to be more involved as a passer, like a pass catcher, and that did not happen. It was Gus Edwards that got the lone target out of the backfield.
Yeah. So, of course, I was burned by using Gus Edwards in DFS and, even started him in a couple places. The end result was not great, but the usage is still encouraging enough here. There's going to be some leagues where I'm going to have to go back to that well. I'll pour a Culver's root beer out for the listeners here while I'm eating my free double bacon cheeseburger here. But you know what? It was tough. It was tough sledding this week with a lot of running backs here. But so Edwards was okay. McNichols was okay. This past week, maybe not okay, but it's still. Brian Robinson ended up playing, right? So Eckler's out for the next few weeks. McNichols was decent. Chris Rodriguez gets a mention on our list because he actually outcarried. Well, he was outcarried by McNichols 6-1 over the first 3 quarters, and then Chris Rodriguez basically got all the mop up in garbage time. So you look at his 12 carries and his decent stat line. But I think a lot of that's a mirage here. So I see Chris Rodriguez showing up on all these lists, but I'm not super interested because as long as the Commanders are in a close game, Brian Robinson is 1A and Jeremy McNichols is 1B. Last week we talked about Jonathan Brooks, 9 touches this week, so definitely trending in the right direction here. They want that 1-2 punch with him and Chuba, so that'll be interesting. We also mentioned Antonio Gibson last week. He was interesting, did a little bit, but obviously we have the Patriots on bye, so he won't be a factor this week. Gibson scored the touchdown, had 7 carries, 23% snap share, but Ramondre Stevenson was back to the top, 77% snap share, 18 carries for 73 yards, no touchdowns, also caught 3 passes for 21 yards. So Gibson, it's not really someone you're excited about holding, but I guess we kind of led people in the right direction on that one.
Yeah, and we talked about Isaac Guerendo, obviously the top waiver pickup this week, one that you're spending all your fab on. I don't mind Patrick Taylor, for example, in like our NFFC where it's 12 teams, 20-man rosters. We're rostering 2 defenses at this point. I'm not really going to change that, but like I think Patrick Taylor as a pass-catching running back to Guerendo, and Guerendo, who's also been injured at various points this season, that's not a bad scenario too. We know that the Niners offense uses their running backs, gives them in situations that matter. So Patrick Taylor, I actually think kind of is right up there with Vidal, and I would take Patrick Taylor over Chris Rodriguez For example, if Jeremy Nichols
definitely.
or Amir Abdullah were available, that's different. But I think Patrick Taylor is kind of quietly a top 3 or 4 pickup from a running back waiver wire perspective, just overall.
Yeah. And, moving along the list here, I threw a Packers note on here because Josh Jacobs has a calf injury and was limited in Monday's practice estimate. They have a short week playing Thursday night against Detroit here. It's a very important divisional game. Watch that situation because if something happens or he gets worse or aggravates it, Chris Brooks or Emmanuel Wilson could be elevated to a top pickup. I think the answer is Brooks right now. He had 28% snaps, 5 routes, 5 touches, compared to 8% of snaps, 0 routes, 2 touches for Emmanuel Wilson. So Chris Brooks is your backup. I don't know if Marshawn Lloyd is.
He won't be ready next week.
Won't be ready. Yeah, exactly. So, obviously, Chris Brooks would be in the top 5 if we knew Jacobs is out. We don't think that's going to happen, but I wanted to make a note nonetheless here. Another name coming back this week, Tank Bigsby, only 44% rostered. He had a 46% snap share, 7 carries for 28 yards. It was basically a split with ETN. He had slightly less passing down work. I'm not really interested in much of that offense with Mac Jones at quarterback, but he throws his name back in the ring as well because he has had some good games previously this year. And then we go to the handcuff tier, right? For running backs here, we're looking at Ray Davis, who I think is inching his way towards the top of that handcuff tier. 32% snap share, 11 for 63 yards, and a touchdown rushing. It was a lot. Some of that was he had the early touchdown, I believe. Mm-hmm. So you can't just attribute that to garbage time too in the snow game against the 49ers. He is interesting there. Blake Corum, our guy, is starting to get used a little bit more. 33% snap share, carried the ball 8 times for 42 yards as a Kyren Williams owner heading into the playoffs. I don't love that, but Corum could definitely be he's someone that I'm going to put some backup bids on this week in my Kyren Williams leagues just in case a changing of the guard does happen or they decide that Corum might take over. Then after those 2 guys, I threw in Algier and Charbonnet, both kind of in the handcuff territory as well. Kenneth Walker struggled a little bit. Some of that's matchup related. Charbonnet got the touchdown this past week. Algier is always live to somehow get you 8 fantasy points. And, you never know what happens with Bijan there. I was listening to Sneaky Ads with Jeff and Nick makes a pretty good point in the favor of Braylon Allen, kind of getting back on this handcuff tier. It's not like they'll phase out Breece Hall as long as he's healthy, but he did have a pretty key fumble in a close game last week. And Braden and the Jets maybe as non-contenders in evaluation mode, seeing what they have to do. Maybe Braylon Allen picks it up, gets a little more usage towards the end of the year. And then I kind of made a long shot tier out here. Kendre Miller is eligible to come off IR. I don't know what that means if we have Kamara healthy and Jamal Williams even healthy.
It's too tough.
It's really tough. It's a good upcoming schedule for the Saints at the Giants, who are 25, and home against Washington, who are 20. I think the coach made a point to say he wasn't in the doghouse, and I guess he was at some point. So again, when you're going out of your way to say that, maybe you're just asked about that. But Kendre Miller, long shot, and then I threw Sincere McCormick of the Raiders on here as another deep long shot here. Obviously, we have Madison and Zamir White working their way back here, but you kind of called this backfield last week, Joe, when you said that Amir Abdullah would still be the passing down running back and Sincere McCormick would be the early down back here. But it's just the rest of the injury report here for the Raiders, and I don't know what that's going to look like come Thursday when you're making a lot of these decisions here. So some deep long shots if you need them.
And for your dynasty managers out there, your Trey Benson shares took a massive hit Saturday when James Conner signed an extension with the Cardinals. He'll be there an additional 2 years. I think the idea of having Trey Benson as the backup in redraft James Conner is totally fine. This will be the first time all year, I am knocking on wood right now, first time of Conner's career, or second time I should say, out of the 8 years that he'll have played more than 13 games. The health is not a thing that happens very often for James Conner, especially running back approaching 30 years old. But I thought for sure Conner was going to be a unrestricted free agent next offseason, and he would sign somewhere else because the Cardinals drafted Trey Benson. Well, not the case, signing him to an extension. In dynasty leagues, if you need a roster spot, you're contending this year, maybe cutting Trey Benson is the worst thing in the world to do. And then I agree with you on the other guys like Zach Charbonnet, Blake Corum. I have probably 3 of those roster in everyone in my leagues. It makes it tough in Bob again part 2, but we just literally saw the exact scenario in which that matters. except it's not with Jordan Mason. It's now with Isaac Guerendo. We could lead the show next week with Blake Corum for Kyron Williams or yada, yada. So those guys, especially as you enter the playoffs, are worth rostering, I think, plenty. Let's go ahead and get a word for a sponsor. Sponsors too from DraftKings Pick 6, but more importantly, our guy Nick Whalen, who continues to dominate in the Scott Fish Bowl. I think once again looking really, really good, and also top 3 in RotoWire Online Championship scoring. Jake, he's having an insane year. And let's hear from Nick.
We're proud to be brought to you by DraftKings Pick 6. So many NFL offerings each week over at Pick 6. Been enjoying playing on the Pick 6 platform each and every week of the NFL season. Think a certain quarterback will throw for more than 300 yards. How about your favorite receiver scoring a touchdown? Check out Pick 6, the newest way to play fantasy football and win cash right now with DraftKings. Here's how it works. Just pick 2 to 6 players of the same sport and choose if they'll have more or less of a given stat. Yards, catches, touchdowns, etc. Lock in those picks and compete against opponents for a shot at huge cash prizes. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use our code ROTOPICK. That's ROTOPICK. Again, ROTOPICK, ROTOPICK. If you're a new Pick 6 customer, play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits guaranteed. Just use that code ROTOPICK. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-78-89-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos.
All right, we're back talking waiver wire receivers. Adam Thielen made our list at the top 5 to begin the show. I mentioned Parker Washington and his 12 targets. Now it's for Mac Jones and the Jaguars for at least a week, if not a little bit longer. And you talked about Westbrook-Ikhine, given his touchdown upside as well, too. We'll throw MVS into that mix as well. But, I mean, it's a group of at least 3 or 4 receivers that are well-known, have high-priority names, and will likely be picked up everywhere regardless of bye weeks. Is there anything outside of that list that maybe matters a bit more or should be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, well, I want to clean up a little bit just for shallow leagues. We mentioned Keon Coleman last week. Obviously didn't play with a wrist injury here. Put him down at 43% rostered after being inactive here. Probably wouldn't have seen a ton of passing volume anyway in that snow game here. But he does, if he returns, next up is the Rams, who are 24th, and the Lions, who are 26th against opposing wide receivers in half PPR formats. Maybe give that a look as a solid stash if he's out there and available. Romeo Doubs got down to 45% after missing a game due to a concussion. I think he's going to be needed and used this week here on Thursday Night Football against the Lions. He finds a way to get open in the zone really well. So I think there will be targets for him and possibly touchdown upside as well. He was listed as a limited participant in Monday's estimate, but I think he should have enough time. Another name that threw up on the list here, Cedric Tillman, 43%, missing last week with a concussion, gets the Steelers this week. He was red hot, one of Jameis's favorite targets before missing that game. But also note that Elijah Moore, if you're looking at Browns, you want to consider Elijah Moore over Tillman. He's only 11% rostered and just had a 14-target game, caught 8 of them for 111 yards. His volume continues to be very, very significant. And then again, we mentioned Thielen, Westbrook-Ikhine, Cooks, Valdez-Scantling, Parker Washington. I think we went in those guys pretty in depth at the beginning of the show. So I'm going to skip ahead to a real long shot stash here. Hollywood Brown's at 18%. He's actually expected to return to practice after week 15 and could play in week 16. You'd be pretty hard pressed to start him in your fantasy championship game.
Yeah.
But man, if something were to happen to DeAndre Hopkins or Juju, and it's possibly there. So if you're in a good enough position that you can stash that, just wanted to throw that name out there. And then and then we're looking at some deep swings, right? Iosivas could be in a high volume game. Ray McLeod is consistently okay in PPR. Demarcus Robinson, he got a hand injury though, so he's a guy that could fill in a pinch if he's healthy. Otherwise, Tutu Atwell, if he sits. Sterling Shepard had 4 of 7 targets for 42 yards. He appears to be above McMillan on that depth chart. So even with Mike Evans back and contributing here, Sterling Shepard is seeing some degree of volume here. So these are some long shots to maybe consider if if you're in a tough spot with bye weeks this week. But really, I think there should be enough options. If I think you'd be hard pressed to find a league where you can't get Thielen, Cooks, Westbrook, Akeen, Parker Washington, or Valdez-Scantling here. I think one of those should be open in most types of leagues.
Real quick, you mentioned Brandon Cooks. I think in the instance that CeeDee Lamb is out against this Bengals defense, Cooks becomes an automatic play. Likely, but they play Monday night, so we won't know the information on CeeDee Lamb status or really the viability for Brandon Cooks. You and I have him in the auction draft in the NFC, for example.
Yep.
I'm picking up Brandon Cooks to protect us in the case that Lamb goes out, not to play in conjunction with CeeDee Lamb.
Yeah, absolutely. As a CeeDee Lamb owner with that Monday night game, or even as, like you mentioned, as a possible Ferguson owner or Schoonmaker owner, get yourself a backup option, and he becomes very viable. So,
I think the tight end group actually has a decent amount of depth. We mentioned Juwan Johnson, who made our top 5 list for both of us. Tight end for the Saints now, Taysom Hill is out. It's a rule of attrition now at this point with all the different injuries they've had to the skill position guys. Juwan Johnson's getting the targets matters a lot, and I think if you're missing Mark Andrews or a few of these other options, I think Mark Andrews in particular for the Ravens.
Yeah, so I listed them out. I mean, Mark Andrews, Dalton Schultz, Hunter Henry, Zach Ertz are on buys.
Yeah.
Dallas Goedert got hurt this week. Taysom Hill's out for the season. Theo Johnson got hurt this week. And a lot of these guys, I had definitely been starting Andrews. Henry and Ertz got starts for me in some deep leagues. And obviously I've got a couple Goddard shares too. So it's a tough week for tight ends. Obviously you have to look at Juwan Johnson. We mentioned his snap share, and he had the most routes run on the entire team. You go from a red zone threat maybe to suddenly you're out of bodies with the Saints, and with Taysom Hill out, Taysom Hill technically being the tight end, but Derek Carr is going to attempt more passes. And, the 3rd and 2 draws with Taysom Hill are out. So that's more pass attempts for Carr, more opportunities for Juwan Johnson. Threw Will Dissly on here. He only had 1 target this past week, but he did top a 60% snap share, which is somewhat meaningful. And, of course, the Chargers only had 147 passing yards with Ladd McConkey getting 117. Dissly actually plays the Chiefs this week, who are pretty bad against opposing tight ends. That defense seems to be crumbling a little bit here. They're ranked 29th against opposing tight ends. And then the following week, Dissly and the Chargers have Tampa Bay, who are 26th against opposing tight ends. So some good matchups there for Dissly the rest of the season. I can see spending a little bit of fab on there if you need to secure it.
Yeah, I like the Dissly call a lot. Again, the Chargers passing attack was more so because they were fine letting Kirk Cousins throw the game away, which the Falcons and Kirk Cousins did. So you also talk about Grant Calcaterra as well as Dallas Goedert out now. Longtime fantasy players will know CJ Uzomah from the Bengals.
Yep.
He was a practice squad signing and elevated right away for the Eagles and had some factor for them this week with Goddard banged up.
Exactly. So I noted from the box score breakdown column that Calcaterra did have a 50% snap share, but only ran 3 routes, while CJ Uzomah had a 35% snap share, but ran 4 routes. Neither had a target. And honestly, I think we're going to see more Devontae Smith if he's back, but also watch that because, that could be another pass catcher down.
Sure.
You could be looking at guys like Dotson getting targets too. But, Calcaterra, Uzomah, you'd have to be pretty hard-pressed, but I honestly weirdly lean towards Uzomah a little bit because remember the last time Goddard was out, Calcaterra did nothing of note.
He was good for like 2 weeks, and then the final week or week and a half, it was something like that.
There just wasn't that much there. In skipping through tight ends, moving on, I saw Pat Freiermuth was only 51% rostered. He's as good of a stream as any of these guys, and seeing a little more volume of late. Again, you'd have to be pretty hard pressed, but Jatavion Sanders of the Panthers is hopeful to return from a neck injury in Week 14. And again, tough matchup at Philly, but Bryce Young getting better could lift everybody else over there. So maybe worth a look. And then I wrote a note here. Tyler Higbee has that knee injury, hasn't played all year, won't play Sunday versus Buffalo, but I'd imagine he's got to be getting kind of close here. So
that was that was like a Week 16 or Week 17 injury. I don't know. Yeah. That would, if he plays, it might be like what we saw with J.K. No, Dobbins was good to start, but like I don't know, a few of these knee injury guys. Nick Chubb hasn't looked the same at all. Christian McCaffrey didn't look the same. That's a good name just because we know who Tyler Higbee is, but I think the passing funnel is almost strictly Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, and then basically nobody else with the Rams. So that's tough, and just like playing Hollywood Brown in the fantasy championship semifinals, that would be pretty wild to play Tyler Higbee in an inconsequential role in the event that he plays in the semis or finals too.
Maybe I got to do a better job of putting on the playoff lenses here. If it were week 3 and these guys were coming back in the same amount of time, maybe. But again, I just like to mention all the names just in case.
I like doing this too with the streaming defenses because we can talk about playoff implications and the defense will be like not just this week for the next couple of weeks too.
Yeah, so defenses this week here. So I found myself in a tough position here. Do I keep the Denver defense when their playoff schedule is Indianapolis, Chargers, Cincinnati? Do I cut the Houston defense, who also doesn't have a great playoff schedule here? So my answer for now, thankfully, or whatever your perspective, I had Jordan Mason to cut. Didn't have to cut Denver yet, but you might want to think about it and stream the rest of the way. The Titans, they're 5% rostered. They're the home team against the Jaguars. And, of course, the Titans have the Jaguars again later on down the road here, and it's looking like a Mac Jones show. And the team's banged up. The offense can't do anything. They're looking at a number 1 pick in the draft here. I rank the Titans number 1. And then the Saints, 27%. I put them as number 2 streaming. They're at the Giants this week. Really what it came down for me is taking the home team in this situation here. And that was the Titans here. I don't know, Mac Jones versus whoever the Giants trot out there, whether it's DeVito or Locke, it's going to be ugly here. And maybe the Saints make a few more big plays here. But I had the Titans number 1. It was real close. I see a lot of people wanting to stream Tampa Bay, who's 53% rostered against Aiden O'Connell. You got a West Coast team heading across the country. I don't really trust the Tampa Bay defense to stream that much here. I just don't know if the playmaking and the pass rush is there even against a guy like O'Connell. Yeah. I mean, if I were starting quarterbacks this week, I would rank O'Connell enough ahead of Mac Jones and whoever the Giants trot out there to a point where I'm throwing that off the list here. So I did that. Then I made a couple other notes. The Cardinals are 16% rostered. They're interesting for the playoffs. They're home against Seattle this week, but then they're home against New England and at Carolina. Drake May, Bryce Young improving a little bit, but they're still very streamable against. And, the rookies could be a rookie or semi-rookie prone to being error prone there. So the Cardinals have a good playoff schedule here. And then you mentioned one too?
Yeah, the Colts, which I like a lot. So they have the bye week this week, Broncos next week. So we're talking about the championship in semifinals. They'll have the Titans in the semifinals, Giants in the championship. And if you play week 18, you have the Jacksonville Jaguars as well, too. So it's 3 straight weeks in which the Colts are likely a top 10 defense. Mm-hmm. And they produce sacks at minimum, can get some turnovers as well, too. When people play that Gus Bradley defense, they know he's basically in zone all the time. Mm-hmm. That works against bad quarterbacks, not so much against good ones. And you can even say his zone defense might be all right against Bo Nix, who we saw, at least this past Monday, a bit turnover prone as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm more inclined to grab the Titans or the Saints this week and then go looking for the Cardinals the week after, or the Colts the week after. But yeah, so that's kind of what you're looking for. And if you subscribe to the site, rotowire.com/pod, if you want to check it out for free, Jerry's got a great streaming defense article where he has basically the playoff grid and his top 10 defenses with their matchups for every week. So that can help your decision making as you're looking to stash defenses here. If you're lucky enough to be able to field a lineup this week and are unable to get Guerendo because you're out of fab or the waiver wire priority isn't there, maybe you could stash some of these defenses now and just shore up your lineup for future weeks. But of course, first and foremost, a lot of you got to win this week, got to get in the playoffs, So despite the NFL making 6 teams on bye week 14, it's time.
Real quick, somebody in the chat asked one I think matters here. Would you roster Cedric Tillman, Quentin Johnston, or Keon Coleman? We talked about those Keon Colemans of the world and Tillmans that had under 50% roster threshold. I think I have an answer, but I'm curious of those 3, Tillman, Johnson, and Keon Coleman, who would you have?
Well, I like Coleman the best rest of the season, I think. But the problem is we don't really know. Out of all those, the only one we know is going to play this week is Quentin Johnston. So even though the drops are coming back and he's had a few pretty rough weeks here, there is always that touchdown upside with Quentin Johnston. So if you got to start one this week, it's Johnston. If you're stashing one rest of season, it's definitely Coleman.
Yeah, and I actually think it's Tillman. I like Tillman more than Keon Coleman. I think Quentin Johnston is a drop. Like you look at the rest of the season schedule for the Chargers, it's difficult. The passing opportunity for Herbert as a streaming one quarterback was really in that week 10 through 14 range. Now it gets far more tricky for Herbert. And with no J.K. Dobbins, we just saw the rushing attack look significantly worse between Gus Edwards, Kamani Vidal, and that dramatically affected the passing opportunities. I think Johnson is clearly a drop in my mind, and I don't want him relative to Tillman or Keon Coleman at all, but something to keep in mind as you are dealing with Buymageddon Part 2. So that does it for us on this edition, the Tuesday edition of the RotoWire NFL podcast. We'll be back in next week entering the fantasy playoffs, and we'll go on throughout the entire season. I think we do one more week after the regular season concludes, right?
I'm actually out next week, but Jim Coventry, who I'm sure you all know from the channel, will be taking my place. So a lot of people probably
we'll
guess
see.
more Jim.
We'll see if Jim is going to take place. He had something kind of come up family-wise. I will have a cover for us.
I talked to him today, and he seems like he's doing it. But anyway,
great.
Yeah, logistics thing, talking out on air. But no, we'll have a sub for you, and then I'll be back the rest of the season ready to roll.
Cool. All right. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and best of luck to hopefully getting all your teams into the playoffs.